Good morning, everyone. My name is Merle Massey. I am the director of I'm the coordinator of undergraduate research at the University of Saskatchewan. And I'm also the coordinator for the pilot program that we have going on this summer, the Student Undergraduate Research Experience, or SURE. This morning, we are joined by Dr. Erin Prosser-Loose of the College of Medicine, who is the Research Equity and Diversity Specialist. Dr. Prosser-Loose has joined us this morning at probably the most timely webinar that we've had so far in our SURE program to provide us a bit of an overview on EDI, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Undergraduate Research. And with that, I will pass the baton over to Dr. Prosser-Loose. And thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Well, thanks so much, Merle, for the invitation to join your group. And it's wonderful that undergrads, that you're still able to do some kind of research project. I know it probably wasn't what you had originally hoped or planned, but I hope that you'll still be getting, something out of your summer experience. And hopefully that this presentation will give you something to think about too. As Merle said, it is very timely. I'm not necessarily focusing in on, racism or anything like that specifically for this, but I think this hopefully will at least give you a bit of an overview of EDI and research and why it's important that we think about it. So I do want to start by acknowledging that we are, or at least myself, and I believe Merle and probably many of you, are on Treaty 6 territory today and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. So I also do want to just remind people that, even though we're virtual these days, that it still is very important to be doing these land acknowledgements and recognizing where we're still gathering or sitting today. And as I said, I'm not focusing today on, anti-racism or racism specifically, but I do want to share at least some resources and acknowledge, what an especially difficult time that our Black colleagues and students might be having right now. Indigenous colleagues and students too are no stranger to, the difficulties and racism that we're seeing these days. So again, I'm not focusing on this today, but here's some resources that I've at least found kind of useful. If you have any that you'd like to share, please do so in the chat or, email afterwards or something. I can include them in lists that I have going out. So I just want to reiterate, that we as an institution at University of Saskatchewan and as individuals in an academic setting really have a role to play in anti-racism in our societies. And I will say that these slides, we're going to make them available to you afterwards, so you'll be able to access all of these links. I've tried to really jam-pack this presentation with links so that you can continue learning and kind of look into things a little bit deeper. So I just want to do a quick introduction of who I am so you know where all of this information is coming from. So I do have a research background. I did my PhD in neuroscience and finished in 2010, followed by a postdoc. I worked for 5 years as a pediatric research coordinator here at USask. And then I've been in this recent position as research equity and diversity specialist in medicine for about 1.5 years, a little bit over now. So I just want to tell you that because a lot of the examples that I'm going to be talking about today do come from kind of a health science background, as that's what I'm most familiar with. But, these issues are very common throughout academia. So I think it'll be applicable to most of you. And I do also want to acknowledge that I recognize I have a whole lot of privilege being a white woman doing this work. I certainly have had experiences as a woman in science and a woman in academics, but for the most part, I haven't had to think about race. I haven't had to think about disability personally because thus far in my life, it hasn't been a part of my personal experience. So the number one thing for EDI and thinking about EDI is that you listen to people who do have these experiences and you believe them. So I think, that's the number one thing in my job is that I'm listening and believing and communicating. Okay, so I want to start with this research study from 2012. Some people might be familiar with it. In this study, science professors were given resumes from students, 2 students, either John or Jennifer, who were applying for a lab manager position. They were asked to rank the students or the resumes on 3 things: perceived competence, hireability, and deserving of mentorship or not. And on all 3 measures, John scored higher than Jennifer and was offered about an average of $4,000 higher salary on average. So the catch, if you don't already know, is that the resumes were 100% identical, except for the names were changed. It's also important to note that professors had this bias independent of their own gender. So meaning women also scored John higher. So this just highlights how we all have some of these biases that are built in, that have been there since, you know, the day we were born and the society that we were brought up in. But it's being aware of these things that's really important. Similar studies were done using white versus racialized sounding names, and they have found the same results. So we are here today to discuss EDI in research. I hope this example kind of reflects to you why this is important. And I'm really convinced that, you know, developing an EDI perspective at the undergraduate level, where you guys are at now, is really important. And it's something that's going to help you in your future, whether you continue on in research or whether you go directly into the job market. These things are top of mind these days. So it's important to start kind of building that perspective for yourselves. So we're going to start by just defining EDI. What is it? Take a look at why it's important in research, and then just a few ideas on how you can develop your own competence in EDI. Okay, so I want to start with just hearing what you all think of when you hear equity, diversity, and inclusion. Maybe just reply with a word or 2 in the chat. Just anything that comes to mind, feel free to write it in. I can't see the chat the way my slides are set up right now, so I've asked Merle to maybe read some out as you guys enter them.
Groups. Equal opportunity for all. Welcoming.
That's a good one.
Everyone is competent. Unbiased. Representation. Equity and representation. Non-exclusive. Community.
Those are all really great.
Diversity of experiences.
Yes.
And including people of all abilities.
Absolutely.
Diversity in ideas enables innovation.
These are great.
Not equal, but fair and impartial treatment.
You guys don't need me. You already know it.
Dynamics is another one.
Yeah. These are great. I can continue on, and if people want to,
not just equality, but equity, creating equivalent access.
Yes, and that's what we're going to talk about next, actually. So I'll continue on. If everyone wants to continue adding things in the chat, that's great. These are all really, they're all correct and really relevant ideas that everybody has around EDI. So we're going to start with, what is equity? So like that last comment said, it's not the same as equality. I think of equity as the what. So here we're providing each individual with what they need to be successful, whereas equality is providing each individual the same or with similar opportunities, right? So this graphic kind of highlights the differences. So if you look at equality versus equity in the picture here, in equality, everybody is given the same resources, whether or not, they need more or less. With equity, we're actually looking at each individual, where they are and what they need to really reach that same level of success, reach that same level of inclusion, and then giving them resources based on that. So the goal here is equity. Sometimes reality is a little bit different in that the people who already have, the most access to resources are given more, and the people who have the least are not given any or are taken away. And of course, the ideal situation is one of liberation where there's no barriers to anybody participating or reaching levels of success. A slight word of caution for this particular graphic is that it promotes a deficit-based reasoning. So kind of the short versus tall, indicating, that short person has less ability somehow, whereas in reality, often people of equal or superior ability are blocked from participating. So just something to keep in mind when you see this graphic, but I do think it nicely illustrates the differences between equality and equity. So when we're talking about diversity, of course, we're just talking about the who, so the people, everyone who is different from each other, the range of human differences, and there's so many. It includes diverse talents, perspectives, backgrounds, worldviews, ways of knowing, skills, opinions, and abilities. But of course, it importantly includes gender identity, sexual orientations, racial identity, ethnicities, cultures, etc. So all of the range of differences that we have. And inclusion, I like to think of as the how. So how are we making sure everyone has the opportunity to participate? It's the action, so taking the action to create a supportive university community in our case here. It's the active process of change, but it's also the outcome. So it includes that feeling of belonging that a person has because of the practices that we've put in place. Belonging is a term that's really starting to show up a lot these days, along with EDI or sometimes in place of EDI, which I like because I think it actually really gets down to what the goal of all of this is that everybody feels welcomed and belongs in research or in our university communities. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about why EDI is important in research. So it's important in research because it's important in our society, our communities, our institutions, and these are all intimately connected with researchers and research design even. So for example, we can see the effects of racial inequities in society reflected in our institutions, among our researchers, and even into the design of our research projects. And vice versa too, right? So who is included in our research dictates who is being served in society. So we're going to focus in a little bit on these bottom two levels, these two triangles, who is doing the research and research design. Okay, to understand why EDI is important among researchers, let's first look at what happens when EDI is not considered. So I can't possibly cover every issue here. I've just sort of given you a sampling here of some examples. Each of these are linked to specific articles that you can read up a little bit further on. So for some examples, racialized faculty are underrepresented in Canada. So it's estimated that about 5 to 17% of faculty are racialized in Canada versus about 22% in the overall Canadian population. So it is important that we have equal representation, especially so that our students can see themselves reflected in our professors and supervisors, right? There's evidence that Black researchers receive less funding from the NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health in the United States, versus non-Black researchers. This next study found that scholars from underrepresented groups, so specifically gender and racial minorities, actually achieve higher rates of scientific novelty versus their majority peers, but their research is less likely to be taken up by peers, and these students are less likely to continue in scientific careers. People in STEM fields will know this. So STEM stands for science, tech, engineering, and math. There's a much higher attrition rate of women. So when you go from a BSc up to a PhD, and then even into assistant professor up to, full professor, up to leadership, we see women leaving the fields. And I don't want to necessarily say they leave. Sometimes they feel that they are forced out. So a big problem in STEM fields for sure. We actually do see this in Canada in some of our funding institutions, that there are gender differences in success rates. And then for LGBTQ identity, they sometimes face questions about whether they quote unquote fit into an institution. So they're certainly faced with biases that result in barriers to opportunities, and again, are less likely to be represented in STEM fields. So what about when EDI is not considered in the design of research projects? So in these cases, we can see underrepresentation, biases, and, in the worst case, unethical treatment of participants in research. So there's a long and really terrible history of unethical treatment of Indigenous peoples by researchers. This includes medical, nutritional experimentation, taking of data, not giving back to communities. I really encourage you to take a deeper look into some of these issues and why now there are so many important ethical guidelines and standards in place in order to be able to research with Indigenous populations. There's a reason why, and the history will show you that. So I don't know if we have any cell scientists or students on the line here, but if anyone is familiar with HeLa cells, I really encourage you to look into the story behind them. So very briefly, cells were taken from a young Black woman in the 1950s who had cervical cancer. Her name was Henrietta Lacks, and her cells were found to be really unique in that they were immortal. They just kept dividing and dividing and dividing at a much higher rate than had ever really been seen. And they went on to be used as a model cell line because of this property. However, in the first place, her cells were taken without her knowledge or her consent, and her family never knew about it until much further on after she had passed away. So really big ethical issues there, something you should really take a look into. So health population algorithms. Now, these are used to identify patients with complex health needs. And one in particular was shown to have a significant racial bias, and that resulted in specifically Black patients not being identified and therefore not receiving the care that they needed. So genome data sets, there's many of them apparently that are actually composed mostly of individuals with European ancestry, very few with Indigenous ancestry or other, people of color, Black ancestry. And this can cause real difficulties when you're using these data sets to try and identify genetic variants in patients who are not of European descent. There's certainly a long history of women being left out of clinical trials, mostly due to the fear that they would become pregnant during the trial. Similarly, there's a belief that female hormones are just too complicated to deal with, so we'd rather just not touch that. So we also see a lack of females used in animal studies, and that is just recently starting to change, at least here in Canada. And men too. So while men have typically been the kind of default model for health science studies, at least, they certainly have been understudied in some cases. So for example, breast cancer. So what do we see when EDI is considered and diverse researchers are represented? We see happier and more insightful researchers. And I know happier sounds a little fluffy and, a little funny here, but it really does matter. When a person feels welcomed and that they belong where they're researching, the weight of that exclusion is lifted, and that energy can then be focused on their work, right? They're not dealing with something else on their back all the time. So I really liked these two quotes about a couple of different experiences from students in science. The first one was from a student who attended an LGBTQ in STEM conference. And they said, "I've never felt more at home in a room full of strangers, to be honest. It was truly a great experience." Now, conferences are a really great way for students to grow their networks, meet other people, communicate their research, but it can be a really overwhelming, also very isolating and exclusive experience for many. So being able to have a positive experience like this right off the bat at a conference as a student is really an important to mean they were better able to communicate their research and grow their networks just because of that weight, had been lifted. And I thought this was a really cool initiative out of Western University, where Indigenous undergraduate students were paired with faculty researchers for summer research projects. And the aim was to kind of marry Indigenous ways of knowing with academic research methods, and just to see kind of what happened. And so this quote from one of the students says, "The program helped him see parallels between Indigenous and scientific knowledge. As he spent the summer researching algae, he saw a similarity between the way the cells transfer energy and how elders transfer knowledge to the next generation. He also found himself singing to his cells the way he and his grandmother would sing to plants in her garden when he was growing up. Like, how, I just think that's so cool. And imagine the potential innovation and new insights that that student could then carry forward into a research career. And if we're not creating inclusive spaces and places for these students, what we're missing out on when we do that. Okay, so what about when we consider EDI in research design? So diversity among researchers is reflected in research design, and that ultimately results in better, more robust research outcomes. So it's been shown that diverse teams can focus on facts and process them more carefully than homogeneous teams. And I think that makes sense, right? When we're in a more heterogeneous group, I think we're more cognizant of communicating more clearly. And that really helps in research teams. Increased innovation certainly comes from diverse teams, just from incorporating a variety of worldviews, experiences, and ideas. This study found increased collective intelligence, which is a measure of group performance. And in this case, it was actually correlated with the proportion of women in the group, which is really interesting. There's been studies that have even found that diverse teams have more citations, so their research is referenced more often. In this case, papers with 4 or 5 authors of multiple ethnicities had, on average, 5 to 10% more citations. So that might be interpreted as having more impact, right? This was a really neat article. Our disabilities have made us better scientists. And the article goes through, various types of disabilities and how they've helped these researchers. One example is that neurodivergence. So, it could be people on the autism spectrum, helps with new lines of thinking, new idea generation, and creative problem solving. Women researchers are more likely to include sex and gender considerations into their projects. And so you can imagine how that's going to produce outcomes that are more broadly applicable, right? And there's growing evidence that Indigenous knowledge is not opposed to modern science and technology, but can actually really help advance it. Okay, so when EDI is considered, I wanted to just, highlight 3 really interesting studies that I thought were important to kind of show what the end result can be when you're being inclusive in terms of both researchers and research design. So again, these are coming from a health science perspective, and they're focused on, including sex and gender. But certainly look into this in your own fields. I'm sure you'll find, kind of similar examples. So this first one was a groundbreaking study from McGill. It was groundbreaking in that it included male and female mice, which at the time, this was 2009, was actually not very typical in Canada. I was still doing my PhD at that time, and I used solely male animals because that was the norm. That's what we did. These researchers found that pain results from actually very different pathways in male and female mice, with distinct immune cell types contributing to pain. When you consider that, 20% of the population experiences chronic pain, and the majority of those are women, there might be implications for drug design here, right? Currently, I think still the pharmaceutical market offers the same pain drugs to everybody. But if the roots of pain are different, then drugs might need to follow suit. The second one was a really cool study. So this actually found that gender-related characteristics, so we're not talking about sex here. So this is not female sex, this is feminine gender roles. So looking at how much a person falls into the kind of more quote unquote feminine gender roles, independent of female sex, was actually predictive of increased risk of recurrent acute coronary syndrome. So I think when people are doing biological research or medical kind of based research, they don't think to include gender or those kind of sociocultural factors. But this is just one study that shows it can absolutely be an important predictor, an important factor in biological studies. And this last one was really interesting. So anybody who I guess, is working with animals. This is a good one for you to take a look at. They actually found that male animal handlers, so male experimenters, caused an increased stress and anxiety response in their rodents. It was due to an olfactory response, and they repeated it over and over and even went through their archival data and showed the same effect. So something really important to kind of look at. So I just thought those were some interesting examples of why EDI is important to consider and the really big important discoveries that can come out of that. So just to kind of remind you, I think you can see that EDI issues in society, whether it's racism, sexism, biases, really trickle down right through institutions and into research. But I think what's most important is that researchers, you as researchers, can address EDI and contribute upwards to a really positive influence on our institutions and our society. So how do you do that? So how do you build your own EDI competency? I think it's a rather intuitive process of self-reflection and continuous reflection as you go, followed by knowledge building, integrating into your research and your work, and then capacity building. So, and at each stage, reflecting further, and then going back and starting over. There's no end destination to this. It's constant learning, and there's so much to learn. But I think you can start by some self-reflection. The variety and the weight of EDI issues out there can be very overwhelming. So a good first step is to really reflect on your own experiences in society. As an undergraduate student at USask, have you noticed inequities in your own environment? Have you spoken to fellow students and colleagues about what they've experienced? So if you're like me, like I said at the beginning, you might have to really listen to others' experiences, as you may not have necessarily had these yourself. So that's a really important key thing to be doing. What resonates with you? Maybe race, gender, equity, access for people with disabilities, health disparities. So I thought I would see if anyone had anything that they were specifically thinking about that might be of interest to them. If anyone would like to share in the chat, we could just see. It can be absolutely anything. Maybe you're already working on something. Maybe something has just popped into your head in the last few minutes, but we'd love to hear what you're thinking. So share a couple words in the chat.
Individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, racial inequalities, mental health disabilities, the lack of research on peripartum depression.
Yeah.
2, LGBTQ plus input, diverse and lack of it in diversity and lack of it in computer science and technology.
Mm-hmm.
Tracking diversity, not just among URMs, but also disaggregated groups. Examples, African Americans versus Africans.
Yeah, so kind of getting into the detail. Mm-hmm.
Micro versus macro inequities. Micro seems so small not to say something, but as they occur over a long time, they have negative cumulative effects.
Yeah. There's a
saying.
Sorry, go ahead.
Women in STEM.
It's saying with microaggressions that it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? It's these things that add up to be just as impactful as macroaggressions. Sorry, go ahead. What else did you see?
Absolutely. Women in STEM. Mm-hmm. Nice broad category.
Yeah, it's a big one. Yeah. Cool. Those are all really great and all super important. And I think, you can think of almost all of those at the level of both researchers, so who's doing the research, as well as research design, and then upwards is our institution. Like there has to be some action too at an institutional level to sort of start affecting some of these things too. So it's a really interrelated problem that we need to be addressing. Okay. So of course, knowledge building, I mean, this just is learning. So read, watch, talk, participate. I've linked to a couple resource pages that we have in medicine here. The first one has resources on bias, cultural humility, disability inclusion, calling out racism, gender, and LGBTQS+. There's also training modules on sex and gender in research. So this is specific to research design. If anybody's familiar with CIHR, this is the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. They are the major funding agency for health research in Canada, and they now require that applicants absolutely consider sex and gender in their research proposals. So to help with that, they have a number of training modules available. Anybody can go on and take them. They're really helpful in just starting to learn about what the issues are, the differences between sex and gender, and those kinds of things, and how you can start thinking about that within your own research. And of course, just search for anything. Search for books, articles, webinars, training modules. I'm happy to share resources if people are looking for something very specific. Feel free to send me an email, and I can try and help point you in the right direction. And I think a neat idea is to keep a self-reflection document as you start learning. Track the progress you're making, skills acquired, personal and professional growth. A lot of jobs, whether they're in research or not, are really kind of starting to focus on EDI. And they might ask for an EDI statement, or it might be a question in an interview. So keeping a document as you're learning can really help you be prepared for something like that. So integration into your work. So as undergraduate students in research right now, you might not have the opportunity to quite do this. Your projects are probably already in place, but it's something to think about for the future should you continue on into research. But this category certainly is very applicable to faculty who might be joining us, or grad students, postdocs, anyone else. So integrating these ideas into your research. So can you be more inclusive of underrepresented populations in your research? Of course, following very ethical guidelines. Can you be more inclusive of sex and gender consideration? Citing diverse scholars. This is something I think we don't think about that often. Who are we citing and who are we amplifying in our work? And can we be more intentional about that? Team composition. So look at who you are usually working with. Is it always the same types of people? Can you diversify that a little bit? And the same with your lab and group environment. Is it diverse? Is it an inclusive place where people feel like they can be themselves there and belong? In service activities. So if you're on committees, you can take a look at who's on those committees with you. Take a look around and ask who's missing from the table, whose perspective is missing. Same thing with outreach activities and professional society activities. In your teaching and mentorship, can you be more inclusive for underrepresented students? Lesson plans that are more inclusive. There's a lot of information and resources out there on how to do that. So I highly suggest looking into those. And then capacity building, we're just really talking about building awareness, building awareness and capacity within each of your own individual spheres of influence. So talking to your peers and supervisors further, maybe you have a lab or a team meeting once a month or once every couple months where you focus on EDI. You could have a bit of an EDI journal club. There's so many academic papers out there on these topics. Look into what the university is doing for EDI activities and trainings. There's usually things going on. And professional societies these days usually have an EDI subcommittee or something similar. So you could look into those too and see if you can get in on those activities. Okay, so I think I've given you an awful lot of information, and if I could leave you with two things to do once you leave, I distribute an EDI e-newsletter every Friday where I share resources, academic, general interest articles on various EDI issues. And it might be a place to start if you're feeling like you don't know where to start. This is a way for me just to give you some papers to read, a quick article to read, and kind of get you started in thinking. So please feel free to email me and I can add you. Something we implemented this past year in medicine, was the Balance and Belonging speaker series. So this consisted of 3 speakers whose presentations were all recorded. So we have the link here so you can watch all 3. Really, really interesting and really relevant, amazing presenters. I think you'll have a lot to learn from each of them. And if you're interested, you can then apply for a certificate of participation once you've watched all three and written up a brief self-reflection. So having a certificate of participation can also, help with your portfolio of EDI experience. So I think it might be a nice way to start too. Okay, so that's all I have to share today, but I think we certainly have time for questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was absolutely delightful. If anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to either unmute yourself or put it into the chat and I can add it to Erin as you wish.
Oh, I see the comment.